Hello, Sublation Media viewers and readers, hopefully. It's me again, Douglas Lane, and this Diet Soap interview with Max Blumenthal that you're about to see is part of hopefully four-part series on anti-imperialism. The first one is with Max Blumenthal. He represents the most strident or militant anti-imperialist advocate that I could find. Tomorrow, you'll find an interview and follow-up with Deep State Cuba from the This is Revolution podcast. The notion here is that there is a problem on the left, just in terms of our thinking and our kind of desire for a socialist politics to develop. We don't actually have a socialist politics at the moment, but as we view the world and its various crises and moments of violence and collapse, difficulties emerge that have a long historic basis just in the socialist struggle. And this series is going to hopefully help us at least understand what the problem is when it comes to imperialism and democracy. I think those would be the two aspects of this difficulty. All right, so here you are with the first in the series, an interview with Max Blumenthal. Max Blumenthal is a journalist who's written for the New York Times, the LA Times, the Daily Beast, the American Prospect, and The Nation.
Sorry, Douglas. I know that you're recording this live, but
it's okay. Go.
I would like to. Maybe we can just. I can just give you a short bio because that doesn't really reflect.
I was going to say you're also with the Grayzone, but go ahead.
Yeah, just if you would just say I'm the editor of the Grayzone. Just briefly about my bio, I just didn't want you to read off a bunch of publications I wrote for in the past that would never allow me to write for them again.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast.
Just if you would just say I'm the editor of the Grayzone and the author most recently of The Management of Savagery, that would be enough.
Okay. Well, you know what? I will just use what you just said as your bio and add that you're also the author of an essay entitled How Zelensky Made Peace with Neo-Nazis, which is the essay I want to discuss with you today. I'm going to start, though, somewhere else. I'm going to start with the fact that we are in a moment which feels too familiar to me. I'm Generation X. You know, I grew up in the 80s and in the 70s and 80s, and I recall living under the threat of a nuclear Armageddon is like one of the reasons why I became a leftist. And I feel frustrated. The other night, I watched the movie War Games with my 17-year-old kid to try to say, look, this has been going on for a while. Don't panic. But after I watched the movie, I felt pretty frustrated because it ought not to be a relevant film anymore, right? Everything politically has changed, and yet we're back in this moment of brinkmanship with mutually assured destruction in the background. And I just wanted to start by asking you kind of a big picture question, which is, why is it, do you think, that the Cold War didn't end after the Soviet Union collapsed? What happened to perpetuate that?
So that's a great question. That's one of the key questions for understanding what's happening now. And just briefly about my bio, I just didn't want you to read off a bunch of publications I wrote for in the past that would never allow me to write for them again. I just didn't want to dignify them. But for making points like the one I'm about to make, which is that, the U.S. wrongly unfairly declared victory in the Cold War. The end of the Cold War was achieved by both sides, the US and the Soviet Union, working together. And the underlying the forces that launched the Cold War in Washington never went away. And so after the Cold War ended, or supposedly ended, the first one, we had the Wolfowitz Doctrine introduced at the Pentagon under George H.W. Bush by a then little-known neoconservative civilian in the Pentagon, someone who had never been to war himself, Paul Wolfowitz. And this doctrine that he put forward called for the unipolar domination of the U.S. across the entire world, and for it to carry out regime change assaults on on the remaining independent nations that had previously relied on the Soviet military support or its protective umbrella. Perfect example would be Iraq, or Iran. These were all, of course, enemies of Israel that he wanted to see wiped out, but also to do regime change operations in Eastern Europe and to move closer into the frontiers of what was left of Russia. This was the mentality in Washington. Mm-hmm. It was sort of not just that they were moving towards rollback. The containment doctrine had been conceived at the dawn of the first Cold War, and it was really the basis for the Cold War by George Kennan, who was Secretary of State who was Assistant Secretary. No, sorry, he was U.S. Ambassador in Moscow, and he wrote to the Secretary of State the long telegram, which was 8,000 words, spelling out his perspective on the Soviet Union, which proved wrong, that the Soviet Union sought world domination through military aggression, and that it had to be contained. There were more extreme elements in the Pentagon, the Joint Chiefs who tried to convince Kennedy to bomb Cuba, for example, who believed in rollback, like actually going to Moscow and doing regime change, destroying the Soviet Union. But containment became the basis for the Cold War. And the idea behind it was to create first of all, a pressure cooker effect around the Soviet Union so that it would become internally destabilized because it wouldn't have the adequate amount of resources or industrial capacity to supply the citizenry and maintain socialism, and externally to deny it a sphere of influence. Where is the Soviet sphere of influence? Well, it was the Eastern Bloc states. And so after the Soviet Union is brought to an end by Mikhail Gorbachev, one of the least popular figures in Russia today, instead of working with Russia and honoring the agreement with Gorbachev, between James Baker, H.W. Bush's Secretary of State, and Gorbachev, to not expand NATO beyond the German borders. I mean, NATO really had outlived its purpose by that point. It was supposedly a defensive alliance to prevent Soviet invasion, etc. They began expanding NATO, waging color revolutions in the former Eastern Bloc states, the Baltic states, basically paying civil society activists, providing them with technology and communications gear, as well as political encouragement to overthrow their government. Figures like Edward Shevardnadze, the foreign minister under Gorbachev, who was friendly with the West in Georgia, he was toppled, and a CIA asset, Mikhail Saakashvili, was put in his place in one of the first major color revolutions. So Russia is, at this point, the victim of a giant crime by the point of the color revolutions. We're talking about the early 2000s, late 90s. The crime was shock therapy imposed during the 1990s by Larry Summers and Anders Aslan and Andrei Schleifer, and this whole gang. They called them like the Harvard Boys. They were kind of like the Chicago Boys, but they went to Moscow to impose IMF austerity, neoliberalism, and 3 to 5 million Russians who had lived off of their pensions, who relied on the state support from the Soviet Union to survive, died, just excess deaths.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Okay. I want to jump in and kind of stick with this post-Soviet moment, because it's really important. The way in which the Soviet Union devolved into a state that was run by foreign, to call it investment is kind of a misguided, but foreign influence and warlords in Russia,
oligarchs, the mafia,
just straight up profiteering in it, and it was a hopeless time for the people of Russia for sure. Despite the fact that there was kind of moments of hope beforehand, where with Yeltsin and some, I think, thought that Gorbachev would bring in a more open and democratic society, perhaps. But it was certainly, for the left in the United States, it was certainly dispiriting, I recall, to watch what was happening in Russia. But even then, as that was happening, there was talk in NATO and in the United States and in Russia, I think, about trying to, even though the economic policy was as bad as it was anywhere else in the developed world, there was still a thought, okay, why don't we bring Russia in? There were conversations about having Russia join NATO. While you talked about Herbert Walker Bush being, influenced by Wolfowitz and having a doctrine of unipolarity, there was still some thought of multilateralism.
Jim Baker in many ways is polar opposite of Wolfowitz. I mean, Wolfowitz had just burrowed from within the Pentagon and was just beginning this influence campaign that really came to fruition under the second Bush. But under the first Bush, Jim Baker, they hated him because he was considered an Arabist. He was friends with the Saudis. He represents the Texas oil industry. And he was sort of a realist. Brent Scowcroft, the ultimate realist, was Bush's NSC advisor. So you have these different factions, but the point you're making is correct. Both Yeltsin and Putin sought entrance into NATO, and NATO demonstrated what it really exists for by rejecting Russia's entry. NATO exists to, in the words of its former director, I believe, to keep Russia out, keep Germany weak, the most powerful country in Europe, weak, and keep the United States strong. In other words, to keep the United States in control of Europe, to make sure Europe is not its own independent entity. Because once it becomes independent, you start to see a coherence between all of Europe, including its largest country, Russia. And I'll get into it later, but that was the U.S. fear of the Nord Stream and Nord Stream 2 pipeline, is it connected the two most powerful countries it through a mutually beneficial economic project, a gas pipeline. It would have been a peace pipeline. That's not what the U.S. wants to see. So NATO is essentially a new Cold War alliance. It was creating the basis for a new Cold War and possibly a new hot war, as you started this discussion, possibility of nuclear Armageddon, because it wasn't just bringing countries in, it was bringing dual use missile launchers during the second Bush administration onto Russia's frontiers. And in, I believe it was 2008, this is when things really reached the boiling point, because NATO called for the entry of Ukraine. That was something most Ukrainians, I believe, didn't even support at the time. But that's just the big no-no. Ukraine, it means borderlands. It's at Russia's doorstep. It's at the point of several strategic ports, Sevastopol and Crimea. I mean, that's Russia's only warm water port. There are so many reasons why Russia would never allow NATO there. But the first one is it's not going to be threatened by the West on its own border. So Putin is there. And so Putin's job basically was to take the 90s and bury that, to turn Russia into a nation again, to strengthen the Kremlin. That meant a lot less democracy, what he called a managed democracy, to get the oligarchs under control, to weaken the mafia.
My kid just came in. Hold on a second.
Yeah, no
I'm on a podcast that I was going to do the other day, and I'm doing it now, but I'll be right over in about 45 minutes or so. All right. That's my 17-year-old kid I mentioned earlier who watched war games with me the other day. So anyway,
Nice.
pick
My
up
kid
where
wouldn't
you left
listen
off.
to me. My kid wouldn't listen so easily because she doesn't speak English yet. But
No, okay. Well,
maybe
probably
in
not
a few
17.
years.
But
So
go
Putin
ahead.
is in. I mean, just a quick history of Putin. I mean, he came in with the blessing of Clinton, with the Russian oligarchs. Boris Berezovsky, at the time most powerful kind of figure, blessed him. The U.S. media was saying Putin was going to continue Yeltsin's great legacy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he came out of the whole St. Petersburg capitalist project, free market project. So they thought, wouldn't this guy be our, Justin? But he also was a nationalist, and he turned out the lights at the, Dresden KGB station at the embassy. He saw the damage of the 90s, and he realized his popularity depended on stability, economic and social stability, reviving nationalism, making people proud to be Russia, basically making Russia great again. And it also it did involve prosecuting some oligarchs in like high publicity show trials. Mikhail Khodorkovsky put in a cage and put on trial while he was in a cage. I mean, he's one of the main funders of the Russian opposition movement now. So 2008, Putin looks at the world and sees that the U.S. is marching across the Middle East, destabilizing the entire region. Iraq fell. It was in a disastrous state. Would have never happened if the Soviet Union was still there. The Arab Spring, starts taking place, and more of the Middle East is destabilized. He gives up power in 2010. Briefly, he gives up the Kremlin to an ally, Medvedev. And what happens in 2011? In 2011, the U.S. invades, destroys Libya, has its leader murdered by Al-Qaeda affiliated proxy fighters in his hometown of Sirte. And Russia abstained at the Security Council. Putin said, "No way, man. I'm coming back." He just comes back in and says, "I'm shutting the door on these regime change operations," stops the Syria regime change operation, stabilizes Syria, which I think prevented the collapse of Lebanon, even though it's already on the brink, prevented ISIS from entering Lebanon. It would have been a complete disaster. Syria was his way of just shutting the door. He's shut the door on the color revolution projects, jailing figures like Navalny, who was the West's kind of great white hope for a color revolution in Russia. And a faction in Washington, which still believes in the Wolfowitz doctrine. Well, the Wolfowitz doctrine is their lodestar, begins to create the basis in the United States for the new Cold War, to get the American public on board with a new Cold War. And these are some of the most unsavory individuals, along with you have the neocons who are in both, they were in the Obama administration, they'd been in the Bush administration. A key figure would be Victoria Nuland, who is now Assistant Secretary of State overseeing Ukraine, Russia, right under Tony Blinken, but who started her career in government under Dick Cheney during the second Bush administration, then moved into the Obama administration. And she's there. They launch a coup in Ukraine after its government accepted an economic partnership with Russia instead of one with the European Union, which would have meted out more austerity. Russia's just sort of the natural trading partner, especially for.
This was in 2011, right?
This was 2014. This is 2014. So you have a leader in Kiev who is considered pro-Russian. That wasn't really the case. He was sort of neutral, and a neutral leader in Kiev is naturally going to have a strong partnership with Russia just because of the historic ties with Russia and that it's right there. You're going to be able to export a lot of grain to a market that it's easier to transport it. You're going to be able to bring in lots of natural gas and other energy for heating in the winter. So that's where he was coming from. He was also corrupt, like all the post-Cold War leadership there was. So 2014, you have the U.S. openly encouraging a coup on the Maidan Square in Kiev. Victoria Nuland is there. She's an Obama official handing out cookies to protesters. alongside the U.S. Ambassador Jeffrey Piat, and they're heard on a phone call that I believe, the phone was tapped, I assume, by Russian intelligence and leaked to the media. And they're deciding, after the coup succeeds and Yanukovych is forced to run for his life, who will serve in the next government. It was a complete puppet government. It showed you exactly what the Maidan regime was. It was a U.S. government to push NATO onto Russia's doorstep. And the first thing that happens there is the ultranationalist forces, which had been unleashed by the color revolutions, but specifically the Maidan supposed revolution of dignity. They suit up in paramilitary uniform. They're incorporated into the Ukrainian National Guard, and they go east with U.S. support to attack the ethnic Russian population in the Donbass, which is seeking to secede because they don't want to be part of this government that doesn't recognize them as Ukrainians. The war breaks out. And back in the U.S., what do we have happening? There was an attempt to kind of do a reset with Russia, a new start with Russia.
This is now, what year are we in with the reset?
We're in 2014. So the reset had happened. It was all about kind of neutering Russia, though. Russia knew it. And when it fails, I can point to so many just insane incidents of Obama officials just provoking a new Cold War with Russia. One would be, I don't know, if you watch MSNBC, you'll see this guy, Michael McFaul, all the time clamoring for harsh sanctions and military escalation against Russia. He was the ambassador for 2 years under Obama. And in 2011, 2012, he gathered all of the anti-Putin opposition and had them come to the embassy for a giant meeting. And he was trying to get them under one umbrella. He was openly organizing a regime change operation inside Moscow. And what the Kremlin did was they had all the state media wait outside the U.S. embassy and just film them all come in and hammer them with questions, accusing them of being sellouts, and aired it all on national TV, humiliating McFaul. He was forced out the next year because he was just exposed. So the U.S. imposes its first sanctions on Russia, I believe, in 2015, the Magnitsky Act, targeting Putin and his inner circle in a very suspicious incident. And I guess we don't really have time for me to describe the whole thing, but this incident was...
I feel like we're getting into the details, which are important to know.
Yeah.
But I'm still, half of my mind is still based on still thinking why the fuck did we end up in this game of Risk? What is it that went wrong so that Russia and the United States and the EU and that couldn't come together through the UN or NATO, repurposed NATO, to form some sort of alliance and compete with each other in the realm of trade rather than militarily? Why is it that this kind of vicious fight, this back and forth?
Yeah. It goes back to what I said at the beginning.
Just to throw one more thing to throw in here is it was even in 2000, NATO was sitting around trying to ask itself. There was a report by a professor, Yuri Davidov, which I found online, about asking the question, should Russia join NATO? And by its own account, it's we've done a number of things that have made that pretty difficult, like our intervention in Kosovo, as an example, that was mentioned in the report. There just seems to be a tendency by the United States to try to set up, as you mentioned, a unipolar world rather than a multilateral one, rather than a one where people are, where the U.S. military is the enforcer of an order rather than, rules of law, fair trade, all of the kinds of rhetoric that you hear is that the West is supposed to be about. And what I'm wondering is, do you think that is a matter of the character of the West, or is there some intrinsic problem within the society, Western society, or maybe the global system, that holds us back from being able to find a way towards a peaceful coexistence with other nations?
Well, you would think, from a kind of a purely materialist perspective, there was no ideological clash between post-Soviet Russia and the United States. So why did all of this start happening?
Right.
And I'm trying to provide the details for people to understand, to fill in the outlines, to provide a more, color to the outlines. But maybe I haven't provided the outline clearly enough.
Mm-hmm.
The United States would not accept Russia or any other country as a geopolitical competitor for so many reasons, all related to the priorities of an elite. I don't think Western society is defective. I think we have a defective leadership that has been weaned on these imperial Cold War era fantasies, and its revival allowed them to, for example, in the Pentagon or the CIA, justify their bureaucratic priorities and their budget. And now we have a record Pentagon budget based on great power competition. That was the Trump doctrine introduced in 2017 with Russia and China. This is like the glory days for contractors in Washington. I mean, half of the Pentagon's budget doesn't even go to equipping soldiers. It goes to private contractors who are gentrifying the city I live in right now and buying, McMansions in the suburbs. That's what that's about. But the other issue is geopolitical. The U.S., if it wanted to topple the Syrian government, for example, found Russia and Putin specifically, and the Kremlin specifically, and his security apparatus rejecting that shabby and destructive regime change campaign and standing in the way. So, of course, Putin is your number one target because you can't take out the other guys and impose little kind of like puppets like King Abdullah in Jordan, or have a puppet like the UAE, which is even worse from a human rights perspective. And so the U.S. will use any weapon against Russia possible to enforce the Wolfowitz doctrine. I think it all goes back to the Wolfowitz doctrine, and people in both parties, as I mentioned, Victoria Nuland, believe in this. It's just about believing in American exceptionalism and empire for them, but there's also a material aspect to it. Victoria Nuland, and I'm just using her as one example of one person in Washington who has a lot in common with so many people here. She was the director or founder of a think tank here in Washington called CNAS, or the Center for a New American Security. Who funds it? The arms industry and the State Department. The arms industry was paying her salary. The arms industry is having, Ukrainians are suffering. People all across the West are suffering. People in Iraq right now are having bread riots because the grain isn't coming from Russia and Ukraine anymore. And the people who live in these McMansions here in outside Washington and Loudoun County, the Lockheed executives, they're having the time of their life. Victoria Nuland's partly responsible for that. They're with the Russian oil ban and this escalation. Yesterday, Congress passed a $14 billion military aid package to Ukraine. I mean, that's military Keynesianism. That's us just shoveling money to the contractors. They don't have Afghanistan anymore, so now they've got this. It's great for them. So that provides you with helps you understand materially. Yeah. There's so much skin in the game for a new Cold War for these people, but there's also the ideology, the insane imperial ideology.
Your essay, it was written for the Grayzone, I think, originally, and it was published a few other places as well, talks about the trouble that Zelensky has had. And I guess we should maybe let you kind of fill in how Zelensky came to power, but my understanding is he was it was one way in which the United States could accept for the people of Ukraine to reject their puppet, would be how I would put it. And he had a lot of support from billionaire money and a long-standing TV program to propagandize with and all of that. But nonetheless, he was more of a democratic choice for the people of Ukraine than the people that came before him. But you mentioned that he had real trouble controlling the Ukrainian military. It would be how I put it. I mean, it's broken into battalions. There are neo-Nazi or far-right militias in Ukraine. that came together and kind of were empowered by the event you described in 2014. They gained footing and were really one of the few forces that were able to resist the Russians at that time. So they got incorporated into the mainstream of Ukrainian state a bit around that time. And then when Zelensky wants to set up a ceasefire, he wants to pull back, he wants to go, he was elected as some sort of peace candidate, he wants to negotiate, he has difficulty controlling him, to put it mildly, right? So when I look at that situation and I look at all the oligarch money that's influential in Ukraine and the way in which he had and how everyone has their own like racket going on, like the people are using each other, billionaire money going to this militia group and then to that militia group. I can't help but notice that there might be something similar. I think you mentioned it happening in the United States as well, only on a different level, where you talked about military contracts and the need for the Pentagon apparatus to get funding and to justify its existence. And that might have been another reason why the Wolfowitz doctrine was appealing to the people in power in the United States, because it served on the most of the needs of the elite. So the largest number of oligarchs in the United States were served by that doctrine. Would you, though, say like something similar is going on in Russia, that they have their own problems with corruption, that there's competition between elites, that the doctrine isn't really being, like the invasion itself was probably not in the interest of the Russian people. So at least not overall. So how do we well, I'm just going to ask it there. Would you agree that that's the case, that this is sort of a worldwide problem of elite dominance and it takes different forms in different places?
I see it as a problem of imperialism. The U.S. is an imperial power. It fits the classic definition of imperialism, where industry and state have merged and the latter is doing the bidding of the former and exploiting the resources, using the military as kind of a resource exploitation machine. The military itself has become a giant ATM for a wing of U.S. a wing of the elite. Russia has a very different situation, although it is absolutely as overrun with corruption as any post-Soviet state. In
Lenin's essay, Imperialism, the Highest Form of Capitalism, he talks about how imperialism arrives through the concentration of capital. Like the way we produce things in society tends to set up unequal power centers. You know, it basically one or two industries are going to outcompete the others and dominate in the collection of the surplus and set up unequal powers. And that will happen within a country, but also happens between nations as well. So that's why in the Lenin essay, England and Europe, and then the United States, maybe, I'm not sure if they were mentioned in Lenin's essay, become imperial powers. It's because of the way that they were ahead in terms of capitalist production and the concentration of capital there. Wouldn't you say today, like in Russia and China and in the United States and Europe, there's a tendency for there to be concentration of capital as well, and that you can have similar dynamics going on in all three major powers? I mean, in a multilateral world or multipolar world, so I should say, aren't we talking about three imperial powers?
We're not in a multipolar world.
I know, but that's what we're trying to aim at, right? I mean, that's what Putin is aiming at. That's what's trying to emerge right now, right?
I mean, we have to look at the physical reality of the U.S. with archipelago of bases across the world, over 800, surrounding and encircling its official designated enemies in Russia, Iran, and surrounding China. No such thing exists around the United States, and no such thing could exist, nor the United States allow it to exist. That's the physical reality, then look at what the United States was able to do to Russia when it sought to sought to wage economic war on Russia as punishment for its operation inside Ukraine, remove it from the SWIFT banking system and target the Russian central bank. That shows that what the essence of imperialism is, that the US has control over the world's reserve currency in the dollar. The dollar is king, and the US enforces the power of the dollar through at gunpoint. So the US can order companies out of Russia, as it has done to Venezuela, as it's done to Cuba, as it's doing to Syria, where you have a nationwide food and electricity crisis because of US sanctions. The US, with its control over the world financial system, is the sole imperial power today. Now, it may be that another country wants to supplant it, but contemporary Russia has no ability to even enforce an imperial doctrine on all of its frontier. If it were able to do so, then it would have already recovered many of the Eastern Bloc countries that are right on its borders. But Ukraine is Russia demonstrating that it will be completely ruthless if it is threatened on its frontier. And in the short term, you can probably definitively say in the short term, this military incursion, which could go on for months, is going to have some really negative economic effects for much of the Russian population. That was something that the Kremlin understood and factored into it. We're going to see in the midterm and long term a decoupling of the US financial system from that of Russia and China, and an even closer bond between Russia and China, which is Eurasia. The largest and wealthiest in terms of resources and population part of the world. And losing that and being if the US is unable to encircle that landmass or politically control it, according to its own, its own imperial thinking, the US is severely weakened. So, we're looking at, I think, 10 years of history at least being decided this week. And I think we're going to see a lot of human suffering in Ukraine and human suffering across the world, including in our own communities where people are struggling with food prices. But that's just that if we want to look at the descent of an empire, I think we need to look a little further. The U.S. continues to be a declining empire, even though right now I think the soft power, the sort of political balance has swung in the favor of NATO and the U.S. They're winning the information war, and they're winning the economic war short term.
The U.S. is winning the
economic war. Short term, yes.
Sure, against Russia, but not against. I think China is still coming out of the COVID crisis with much more secure and productive economy than the United States. At least that was the case the last time I looked, like a year ago. And Russia's economy has been pretty weak for a long time. This is a big blow, I would think. But this is something else I tried to think about, because I'm trying to do like a Marxist thing, right? I publish books that I wanted to perpetuate Marxism. I've been doing podcasting for over a decade, and learning as I go. It's sort of an autodidactic process here. So one of the things I've been trying to think about is how the economic crisis of 2008 and the economic crisis of the 70s set up not just economic policies that ultimately failed. Like, for instance, in the 70s, we transformed the economy from a Keynesian one into a neoliberal one over that from 73 to 83. But also how that has, this is where it gets tricky, how has these economic problems shaped American foreign policy and world policy? And so going back to the moment where the Soviet Union collapsed, what was it about the economy at that moment that put these like Friedmanites, these shock doctrine guys, into a position of authority and setting policy for the United States. If it had happened in the 70s, we might have tried to rebuild, or certainly if it happened in the 60s, we might have tried to invest and rebuild the Soviet Union and build up their productive capacity, and we would have been in a much different place. And why wasn't that done, do you think? And what was the different there? Was it the economy? Was it a weaker neoliberal economy that set the terms there?
I don't know. In the 1970s, didn't the U.S. send a similar cabal of economists to Chile after the CIA operation?
Okay, you're right. I'm off by a decade, maybe, or two. I'm really thinking of even earlier than that. I'm thinking like after World War II, when there was the beginning of a boom and the United States rode high, and there was a sense of we should reinvest in the countries that are just devastated after that war. And I'm kind of assuming, without knowing all the history, that kind of, during Fordism, that kind of nation building approach would have been dominant up to a certain point. But by the 70s, we were in an economic crisis. But I probably am off in my one-to-one kind of thinking like economic stability means this kind of policy. But anyway, I'll let you talk and stop defending myself from that mistake.
Well, I mean, look at how the United States economists in the U.S. who were dictating economic policy from the post-war era to the 1990s shifted. I mean, it was a Keynesian approach from FDR on. I mean, all the way through the Eisenhower administration, building the national highway system, massive infrastructure projects, the Great Society under LBJ. Nixon creating the EPA. Nixon had many liberals actually in his and Keynesian types in his administration at the cabinet level, even while he campaigned as the sort of like for the good people and around the Southern strategy. The United States was still acting was still but it still had kind of an industrial policy that was state-centered until the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then the neoliberal economists rose. I mean, they sort of just it felt like they just quickly took over. Why? Because there was no longer a threat of socialism or communism. There was no longer another pole that Americans could look to. It was as we all know, I mean, it's just any sort of leftist knows that the New Deal was just implemented to weaken and suppress demands for something much closer to Soviet-style socialism and the rise of actual communist parties and communist mobilization, along with, the House American Affairs Committee and all the political attacks. The American public was actually given something. The GI Bill. I mean, all of this weakened the demand for socialism in the United States. And then once the socialist bloc was defeated, well, the neoliberals came out of the woodwork and just implemented their fantasy. And, going all the way up to the early 2000s, I think if you were it would be hard to have imagined that neoliberalism would ever face any pushback in the United States. It was really the financial collapse that started, I think, reshaping the way that Americans see their own government. And right now you see on the political right, there's a massive surge of populism. Many people who suffered the most from the foreclosure crisis, who had their jobs outsourced under NAFTA, who suffered the kind of abandonment of the Rust Belt, the opioid crisis, and who suffered from the lockdowns, the COVID lockdowns, small business owners. They are firmly anti-establishment, and they're just this wild force in the country. So neoliberalism, the opposition to neoliberalism, although they is expressed ironically by that and paradoxically by that element as anti-communism, just because that's our national religion and that's the only language they have to express themselves. But they're obsessed with, Davos and the World Economic Forum.
I think the left is somewhat responsible for that as well. Like too many of us are too quick to embrace the progressive side of capitalism, and say, oh, well, we have to line up behind, even though we hate the Clintons or we hate the Democratic Party. And when push comes to shove, we have to line up behind, I don't know, the mask mandate and engage in that culture war bullshit and stuff like that. When it just feeds the right, and we certainly don't distinguish ourselves very well from the progressive state in the United States when we do that. But I wanted to go ahead.
It brings people to the right the same way they were brought to the right in Eastern Europe after they had their pensions taken and they lost everything. That's why the right has risen there. And, Putin is considered a right-wing, even fascist leader in the United States. But we should know that Putin prevented the hardcore right-wing takeover or the influence of a real right in Russia by just simply imposing a kind of cold nationalist conservatism when a figure of Vladimir Zhirinovsky was rising in the late days of Yeltsin and was really their right-wing leader. Putin headed him off.
With U.S. support.
With U.S. support, correct.
Yeah.
So I just don't think that the U.S. I don't know if the U.S. at any point would have. Well, I guess you have to look at the way that U.S. economists and the U.S. political class treated its own population since the dawn of the Cold War to understand how they would treat the post-Soviet population. And what Gorbachev was asking for from the U.S. was social democracy. His fantasy was to have some kind of Scandinavian style social democracy.
Yeah, it's every leftist fantasy in the world, right? Is a Scandinavian style. Bernie Sanders, Gorbachev's,
and he got Mad Max. He got Thunderdome.
right. But what I don't know. I just read these documents like the one about from within NATO, and I see that there are elements in these institutions that are like you can be really cynical about something like the UN, right? And say it's an institution that's really in the service of the world powers, and mostly the United States and Europe. It kind of does its bidding, and certainly since we've rejected being held accountable by the International Criminal Court or the UN, it doesn't have a lot of teeth, or can't rein in the major power in the world, which is the United States. But nonetheless, it was set up, and the reason it exists is to try to head off exactly the kind of situation we're seemingly facing now. The idea here was to try to set up some sort of system of law, some sort of approach to world governance, where we wouldn't have one power dominating and bullying the rest, and we also wouldn't have the kind of conflict that arises from that kind of thing, because it was no longer feasible to allow another world war. It was no longer feasible to allow that level of conflict between major nations after the threat of nuclear Armageddon raised its ugly head after World War II. So I just wonder, when you look at this situation, what do you feel is the most, what do we need to do to get away from this game of risk and get to a world where some sort of coexistence could occur? Because it doesn't seem to me that there's any ideological justification for what's going on. It seems just like systemic failure all the way down, from politics to economy. It's not like I don't believe there's a group of bad people who are primarily responsible. It's just that the better ideas are not prevailing. We just aren't organized enough. But anyway, I'll stop. I'm lecturing now or pontificating too much, but you go ahead.
I think we're both pontificating or thinking out loud.
Yeah.
I'm not, solutions oriented person. I talk to people like Alfred de Zayas at my at the Grayzone, who has spent his life thinking about and teaching international law and international relations and thinks outside the box. I met him actually at the UN Human Rights Council. We spoke at a breakaway event together, a break-off room, like it wasn't an official HRC event, on Venezuela. And he's kind of a defender of the non-aligned countries that constantly come under attack from the US, as well as Western Sahara and the Palestinians. And he wants to reimagine international law because what we have now is sort of irrelevant, or it's definitely not protecting populations from being overrun and abused. In a multipolar world, larger countries are going to want a sphere of influence. And that means countries like Taiwan or Ukraine are not only caught in between, but they have been cultivated by the most powerful country since World War II, the United States, as outposts of influence or bastions of empire. And that population, as the countries that they have been weaponized against get stronger, is increasingly threatened. And international law is completely irrelevant. And these conflicts will be settled by force. And that's what I consider the danger. As we move towards a multipolar world, the United States is weakened as an empire.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I mean. You say these other countries, major countries, China, Russia, maybe India, will want to have their regional influence. But when you look to the United States as a model for having influence, it's a fucking ugly show. I mean, you could list all the atrocities that the United States has committed in the name of the holding on to their influence. And so I don't want to see, I don't think it's going to be an improvement, especially given how quickly this has turned into a threat of Armageddon. It's not going to be a great improvement for everyone to be trying to have influence in the same way as the United States, like some other outcome than simply recreating the same dynamic in other parts of the world has to be we should be aiming, as people on the left, we should be aiming for some other outcome, because I just think that's ugly.
Well, yeah, I mean, we should be there's so many people who have been emotionally, they're having like there is an elite and semi-official campaign to force this collective psyche of Americans, but mainly like the people on the coasts who are most responsive to propaganda, into a psychological meltdown over Ukraine. But this never happened over Yemen, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world until this. It never happened. It never happened over Syria, except in this kind of propagandistic way through U.S.-backed information warfare outfits like the White Helmets to encourage more war and a regime change war. But it never happens over Congo, the site of what you could possibly call the worst genocide since World War II. And in all of these cases, you have colossal violations of international law, often by the U.S. And so anyone who, any country that wants to that wants to use brute force against a U.S. proxy, for example, can just point to something the U.S. said, and they have no credibility at all. No, international law, therefore, loses any credibility when the U.S. tries to wield it. But and the whole U.S. public, any smart person in the U.S. would just scoff at Hillary Clinton today, pointing the finger at Russia for alleged bombing of a maternity clinic in, I think, Kharkiv in Ukraine. So
I remember the way I remember the Gulf War. I remember the reports of them throwing babies out of incubators that was set up to justify the invasion of Iraq. Yeah. And I know the kind of propaganda that you get during these moments. But I do want to say something about the reason why people on the coast. I'm in Portland, so I'm on the coast. It's like you're not.
I mean, I'm all that. I'm here in
Yeah.
DC, so
Yeah, right.
that's how I understand.
But I think that there's a difference between the Congo and Yemen and all the and even Afghanistan and Iraq, which are did capture the people's imaginations and were sites of fear. This seems like a return to the 20th century in its worst moments because, again, of the nuclear threat and the possibility of bringing in multiple countries and reenacting, what have become like fictions for us, but which were terrible moments in history. Which I think if we were to see them again, the level of devastation and damage done to the people would I think Putin was right. If we walk down this road towards nuclear conflict, what will be unleashed will be like nothing we've ever seen. As I think so, that may be why the people on the coast and people who are paying attention to Ukraine are so concerned. It's not because we are thinking about the human rights violations of people in Ukraine, although those are terrible, I'm sure, and I don't want to minimize that. And it's not because we're wanting to overlook the violations of the Russians that were in the eastern part of the Ukraine and or certainly not Yemen or Libya. It's because this could blow up in all of our faces, and maybe that's self-interested, but I think it's a natural kind of self-interest to have.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the question is here, but
the question is just, I don't know. I guess my question is, can you, just how are you holding up? Maybe like, do you feel the same pressure about the possibility of this blowing up in our face? Do you feel like we're at a world historic moment? Am I overreacting to this? Do you think we're going to get to a point where this is, that starts to be in the background more as normalized? Or do you think we are in real danger here of something that didn't happen in the 20th century, that didn't happen during the Cold War, but could happen now?
I mean, I actually think that we're already experiencing the repercussions economically, and the economic effect might be the worst of what we experience, which will lead to, as we saw during the pandemic, like lockdowns in the global north, where the economy was shut down, triggered mass death in the global south because so many people were living on the precipice, whether in India or Africa. Their countries depend on exports. The Senegalese fishing industry was destroyed. People don't know this history, and the supply chains were all broken, and now they're being broken again. So we're going to see mass excess death as a result of not just the sanctions. War, but the sanctions. So
because
they're saying it openly. They're saying it openly here in Washington. They're saying, you saw Stephen Colbert. He's basically like the court jester now of the ruling elite. And he said that we need to accept gas prices at a few dollars more per barrel, per gallon, because we need a clean conscience. And anyway, he drives a Tesla. And that's not, as disgusting as that statement was, it's not, it papers over the real effect of higher gas prices, which is higher food prices, fertilizer not coming in, food not being planted. I was talking to some truckers yesterday who tell me that it costs them over $1,200 just to fill up their tank now, and they're bringing the food to us. So the people who are on the precipice are going to suffer, and some, yes, they will die. England is in a catastrophe right now with food prices. It's like 51% higher than last year, 50% higher than last year.
Yeah, and that was happening even before this. That was the food prices.
Yes, that's before. That's before.
Yeah,
that's before. The government's job is, and I line up with the libertarian America Firsters here. They're the only ones saying this. The government's job is to take care of its people. And so if you're going to impose an oil embargo on a country just to stick it to their leader, and you're going to let large numbers of your people suffer and die, then you need to be removed. You're not taking care of your people. And that's what our government is doing. And economic elite that are behind it are completely on board with this. So that's one aspect of something we're already experiencing that. And the middle class in the US completely gone. Like mortgages are going to go up massively. No young person's ever going to be able to buy a home in this economy unless they come from money or have access to it somehow. But when you talk about edging towards conventional war, I was actually just on a show on CGTN. It's the Chinese broadcaster in Washington. And they have this show called The Heat, where someone like me can get brought in a debate with like top think tank fellows from the like pro-war think tanks or legislators and foreign officials. It's one of those rare forums where I actually get to trade blows with them. And a Ukrainian lawmaker was on, and she was making the case for a no-fly zone and said this conflict won't be resolved in any way except military force. And that a no-fly zone just means protecting people from death. And so I got to explain what a no-fly zone really meant, which you and any thinking person understands.
It means bombing Russia. Yeah, it would mean bombing Russia is what it would mean, because you'd have to stop. Yeah, I mean, it would be immediately just a war. It would be a conventional war between the United States. You're absolutely right. It's insane. And the fact that Zelensky's calling for that is something that, I mean, I guess I kind of understand why he's doing it, but it's obviously you're going to have to reject that if we want to hold on to whatever level of peace there is right now. Do you think if the United States had and NATO had agreed, look, we're not going to invite Ukraine in to NATO, this is off the table, and that would have been enough to stop Russia from invading?
The two friction points where world war could erupt are Ukraine and Taiwan. If the U.S. would just get the hell out of there and force the Taiwanese government and the Ukrainian government to deal with their neighbors on real terms, they would have to become neutral. And the risk of conflict would dissipate by the day. But the U.S. will not allow that for the reasons we discussed earlier. Imperial hubris and just like, all the money that can be made off of everlasting war conflict. So that's what Putin is demanding. And he is being portrayed as a tyrant for demanding a neutral Ukraine. That's the whole point of this war. That means that Ukraine's government agrees in negotiations to never join NATO, to recognize Crimea, which had a national referendum with massive participation to join Russia, and to recognize the pro-Russian republics of Luhansk and Donetsk as independent as well. And to be politically neutralized, that is something that, first of all, the Ukrainians west of the Dnipro River, who are very nationalistic and harbor all of these historical grievances against Russia, are not able to accept. And it's the job of
why wouldn't they be able to accept being neutral in terms of NATO? I mean, that wouldn't, if they were an independent sovereign nation that just were not aligned with NATO, that wouldn't be satisfactory because they want to get revenge on Russia, or what would the reason be that they would want to hold on to?
So it needs to be. It should have been imposed on them, not through military force, and it could have been imposed on them by the West saying, sorry, we're not going to support you militarily, and we're not giving you any economic support until you agree. And what we've done instead is embolden the ultra-nationalist elements who really ideologically are enthusiastic for crazy war with Russia to settle historical grievances, and who wave banners of Stepan Bandera, the Nazi collaborator, in the street.
Yeah. When you're talking about nationalism, you're not even talking about national sovereignty for the Ukraine. You're talking about ethno-nationalism in Ukraine, right? These neo-Nazi groups. Yeah.
And these neo-Nazi groups, they have this idea of the Reconquista basically is a maximalist idea of a white reconquest of Europe. That's the Azov Battalion, which is the fiercest fighting force in the Ukrainian military, incorporated into the National Guard. They have a ideological, political wing called the National Corps, and they talk about the Reconquista, but they also have a
just the other day, a friend of mine who writes for the Black Agenda Report in a private chat described the Russia-Ukraine conflict as white-on-white crime. So I'm not sure how do these neo-Nazis in Ukraine understand whiteness, and why does that set them up against the Russia, which is
that's just that's an sort of a statement that whitewashes or just overlooks the politics and the powers at play, and it's just a way of dismissing the whole thing as like crazy white people killing each other because white people are pathological. I mean, I can understand the thinking, but it's just, and it's kind of funny to say it.
What is the ethnic difference? I mean, between these neo-Nazis?
It's the perceived ethnic difference. Ethnic difference. So when you listen to someone like Ole Tianbach, who was the leader of the ultra-nationalist party in Ukraine, which has garnered some popular support in the past. It was founded as the Social National Party. He denounces the Muscovite Jewish mafia, and a lot of them see Russian and Jewish as almost synonymous, because, for example, when Ukraine was under Soviet occupation, as according to the nationalist narrative, the NKVD, the sort of Stalin's secret police, were dominated by Jewish leaders, Jewish officials. The same thing in Hungary. The 1956 Soviet intervention in Hungary was precipitated by pogroms because many of the Soviet, pro-Soviet leaders in political officials in Hungary were Jewish. And so, the followers of the nationalist Hungarian leader Miklos Horthy became anti-Semitic on that basis. And then they developed anti-Semitic conspiracies about sort of like global bankers the Rothschilds supporting the Soviet Union to do this to them. So it's just baked in the cake there. And then they hate Russians, ethnic Russians, because of the historic conflict, and they are willing to act genocidally against them, as we saw in Odessa at the trade union massacre in, I believe, October 2014, where like over 40 ethnic Russians were burned alive and beaten to death in the streets after protesting the Maidan regime change. So, so the ideology of the Azov Battalion relates to all of Europe, but also specifically to the parts of Europe that border Russia, Hungary, Poland. They want to sort of establish a nationalist bulwark between the West and Russia. That is also in many ways anti-Western, because they reject the liberalism and social democracy of the West, and they are traditionalist. It's really unusual, but these forces it doesn't represent the majority of Ukrainians, but these forces have just been emboldened and armed and trained to the point where they have veto power over so many decisions that are made at the top in Ukraine right now, or at least until this assault took place. And it's why denazification was such a priority for Russia's political leadership.
Do you think that Zelensky, if this hadn't occurred, do you think that Zelensky would have been able to get somewhere at all with his anti-corruption efforts, and been able to solidify the state against these oligarchs? And
I mean,
because I know that was partly without an oligarch, right? But that's the same thing of for a lot of, Lula was involved in some corruption scandals. We can't, there's political realism here. And I would say Zelensky was, for the Ukraine, a reformer, and with some democratic ambitions. Wouldn't you think that? that Zelensky
I was pulling for him in the beginning. I thought, he was elected because most Ukrainians were tired of the conflict. Ethnic Russians welcomed him. The ones I talked to, it was their best chance for peace, they thought. And that was quickly taken off the table, and he embraced the fascistic elements because
that happened, around 2020, or that when did Zelensky get forced to embrace a more warmongering position?
It's just the conflict in the East just kept simmering and escalating, and the U.S. keeps bringing in military trainers, keeps bringing in weapons. I think the key pivot point was when he and his government prosecuted Viktor Medvedchuk, who was the leader of the For Life Party, which was the main ethnic Russian opposition party. And the home of Medvedchuk was attacked by neo-Nazis leading up to this point. Legislators from his party were shot traveling to a meeting in a bus by Azov thugs with rubber-coated steel bullets. And then Zelensky presided over the banning of all of Medvedchuk's TV and news stations. And the State Department came out and officially, overtly supported the banning of all those stations. So the U.S. was encouraging him all the way to de-democratize Ukraine and ban the main opposition party. Why? Because Medvedchuk was the bridge to Russia. And as long as you allow him to be there, Russia and ethnic Russians are going to have a say. Putin is the godfather of his daughter. So they were close. But this was just a political attack on all the constituents, the entire ethnic Russian population, with the full support of the U.S. So Zelensky was really it was like a pincher attack on him as the peace president from the U.S. and the ultranationalists. And what was he? He was supposed to perform a role as an actor. And so he's now in the role of his life. And I'm sure he's in some twisted way, really enjoying being the lead actor on the world stage with the eyes of the world on him. And he's a hero to many people who had no idea who he was a few weeks ago.
I know. I knew who he was barely. I remembered him from the Trump phone call, right? And that was probably the full extent of my thoughts on Zelensky. But yeah, if you've seen his television, as soon as this started to heat up, I watched Zelensky's program, Serving the People. And it's very difficult not to end up rooting for this guy. He is a good actor. It's not like it's the greatest television show ever, but it's pretty good. It brings you along. And part of me thinks, yeah, you couldn't make this program this way if you didn't in some way believe in the principles that are in the show. If you didn't, this could not all just be cynical. And on the other hand, I know that, it's very easy to run a campaign. It's very difficult to hold up to those principles, especially when the principles are pretty vague. Really stop and think about anti-corruption as the main principle or aim of a reformist candidate. That's only going to go so far. But nonetheless, I feel very much stuck. I kind of would like to see an outcome where what we were talking about earlier, where Ukraine would become neutral, Zelensky would be able to maintain power. The neo-Nazi battalions were stepped down, were taken offline, and Russia did not absorb all of Ukraine, did not aim at trying to control the Ukrainian government. Do you think that's?
I don't think Russia wants to absorb all of Ukraine. That's the misunderstanding of like a lot of the U.S. pundits is that Putin's going to march on Kiev and then go west, and if Russia has to enter Kiev, that is the beginning of some kind of disaster.
Aren't they? Isn't there a convoy headed for Kiev right now?
They're there. They're there. They're in this. They're in the northern suburbs. They're taking suburban areas of Kiev. But to go in there and take it over as the U.S. did in Baghdad, I don't think that's what they're aiming for. It may be what they feel they have to do, which would be disastrous. But Russia's focus is on the east. And if you look at Russia's state TV channel, Channel 1, published a map to show the Russian public where the military was, to give them confidence in what they call Operation Z. And it showed the complete encirclement of the best units of the Ukrainian military in the east, around the Donbass and Mariupol area. And that pretty much spells the end of the Ukrainian military. And so what they're doing is simply attacking the Ukrainian military, destroying the Ukrainian military. And as the Ukrainian military is being destroyed, they're negotiating, high-level negotiations, telling them the end is near, agree to our terms. And the terms they want are control over the east and to neutralize Ukraine as a potential NATO partner. They say it openly. They've put their terms out there constantly. So you can disagree with the terms or you think they're just horrible, but it doesn't relate to a total conquest of like west of the Dnipro, where you have like Lviv and this completely monolithically Ukrainian, non-Russian, and largely nationalistic population. That would be sort of like a rump state. And there's talk of bringing Yanukovych back, but I mean, I can't predict what will happen. I just think if Russia is to get exactly what it wants using force as a negotiating tactic, just like this Clausewitzian approach, they will have a neutral Ukraine and political control over the East. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And all right, well, I mean, what does the U.S. want? They want an insurgency. I mean, that's what we as Americans like. I just want to say in closing, like I got to go, but there's so much pressure to virtue signal on social media if you're on the left and you're anti-war because you get associated with Putin or something. Because you get associated with anti-Americanism because you're anti-imperialist, and so you get pressure to say like, I denounce Putin's illegal war and so on. Fine, go say that. Russia doesn't care. The Russians obviously don't care because they're willing to like be completely severed economically and culturally from the West to achieve these objectives in Ukraine. So they don't care what you say. We have less and less democratic power in the United States. There's more and more control over social media and every other platform that we use to express ourselves. But if any government is going to listen to us, it's ours. And the anti-war movement is not in the streets right now. They should be out in the streets opposing a no-fly zone, opposing the package that Congress passed, sending more weapons into Ukraine, and opposing any escalation. Because people in this city, in Washington, who voted for these packages, conceived them, made the weapons, they don't care about Ukrainians. They really don't. They want to fight this war to the last Ukrainians. The only thing they care about is balkanizing Russia and smashing it into pieces and returning it to what it was in the 90s. That's all they care about. So opposing escalation will save lives in the current political reality, whether you like the reality or not that's been created.
Well, I think there's no one on the left who is supporting escalation that I know of. That
they're not, but they're not taking action like I think they should. And they will. Right. I know they eventually will. But you're looking at all these images of suffering of Ukrainians. You're seeing the war portrayed as a pure Russian aggression and Putin as a madman, and it's throwing the left on its back foot. I think it shocked a lot of people. Right up to the war, the war's been going on since 2014 in reality, but this massive escalation of the war, you had the U.S. saying there was going to be a Russian invasion by Tuesday or Wednesday, and then the next Wednesday they said Russia's going to invade. We think they're going to invade. And everyone, like most people I knew on the left, were saying there's no way that Russia would do this. And then Russia did it, and it frightened them. It shocked them. And so I think they're now kind of demobilized, and they need to keep the focus on what the focus should always be on, which is what is happening in their own country to prevent this from reaching a point of no return.
Well, okay, last question, and I'll let you go. What do you think about the, we're talking about the American left. What do you think about the Russian left, the people, the peace movement? I don't know if they're left. The Russians that are calling for peace there.
I don't have any. I've listened to some interviews with them, and I don't have any connection with them. And it's not for me to tell them what to say. And it's honestly what they tell me. It's I guess it's sort of a noble human impulse to protest the wars of your government, especially when it's acting against a country that seems weaker. But it has no effect on what I'm trying to do with my journalism or advocacy here in the U.S., which is focused on my own government. And I guess I am also suspicious of the Russian left as a bloc, the same way I was suspicious of the so-called Syrian left that was presented to me and was ultimately used as cover for a dirty war project. And they were shopped through Haymarket Books and various other, the Trotskyist entities like the ISO, the International Socialist Organization, or what I would call the International PSYOP, to sell a regime change war behind Marxist guys, or some of them were presented as anarchists or whatever. And they all have these shady backgrounds. And I think, the Russian left is a much more organic entity. And I honestly, like most of the leftists I met when I went to Damascus, where all of them were opposed to the regime change war. But I don't have the same understanding of the Russian left to give that answer. I just am completely focused on what I know and what I know about and where I think I can affect change.
Well, listen, I appreciate that. Thanks for coming on. And I feel like I appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, no, I really enjoy these talks. They're therapeutic for me, and I learned a thing or two. Okay.
If you enjoy these videos, you should click on the subscribe button and click that bell. You should also consider supporting me on Patreon. Patrons get access to a second behind-the-scenes parrot room discussion where we dish out gossip or go into the weeds on topics such as the tendency of the rate of profit to decline, imperialism, and the critical theories of Tiffany Brissett and Donald Most. You'll also get access to both the public and private version of the revised Pop the Left series with Ashley Frawley and Pascal Robert, and the new Zoomer Philosophy series. Your support will not only make content like this possible, it will also help to establish a new publishing venture through Diet Soap Media. Right now, supporting me on Patreon will make a big difference.